Since Texas resumed executions in 1982, over 500 condemned souls have walked into the state's death chamber, but only 9 cases shattered every assumption about how humans face their final moments. In this video, we will dissect the executions where everything went wrong, where the warden walked out mid-procedure, where a victim's mother begged the governor to spare her son's killer, and where final words exposed corruption so deep that prosecutors are still in prison today. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some of the most hardened prison officials in Texas now refuse to witness another execution. Case 1. Charlie Brooks. Executed date, December 7, 1982. Final words, "I love you," said to his girlfriend, who was a witness. He also told the warden, "I'm ready." He had earlier participated in a Muslim prayer. The last meal, T-bone steak, French fries, ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, biscuits, peach cobbler, and iced tea. On December 7, 1982, Charlie Brooks Jr. became the first person executed in Texas after the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. But his place in history extends beyond state boundaries. Brooks was the first person in the United States to die by lethal injection, marking a pivotal moment in American capital punishment. The crime that led to this historic execution occurred on December 14, 1976, when Brooks and an accomplice, Woody Ludres, visited a Fort Worth used car lot under the pretense of purchasing a vehicle. The victim, David Gregory, was a 26-year-old mechanic working at the lot who agreed to accompany the men on a test drive of a white Buick Electra. What began as a routine business transaction quickly transformed into a deadly crime. During the test drive, Brooks and Ludres forced Gregory into the trunk of the vehicle at gunpoint. They drove to a remote motel where they bound and gagged the young mechanic before placing him back in the trunk. The two men then drove to a secluded area near Benbrook Lake, where they shot Gregory execution style in the head while he remained trapped in the trunk. The investigation moved swiftly after Gregory's body was discovered. Police traced the stolen vehicle and linked it to the crime through witness testimony from a car lot. Both suspects were arrested within days of the murder. During questioning, each man blamed the other for pulling the trigger, but the evidence painted a clear picture of their joint involvement in the kidnapping and murder. The trial proceedings reflected the brutal nature of the crime. Prosecutors argued that the murder was committed during the course of an aggravated kidnapping, making it a capital offense under Texas law. The defense attempted to argue that Brooks was not the triggerman, but the jury found him equally culpable for his role in the kidnapping that led to Gregory's death. In 1977, Brooks was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. His case became a test for Texas's newly adopted lethal injection protocol, which state officials promoted as a more humane alternative to the electric chair. The method involved a sequential injection of 3 drugs: sodium pentothal to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to cause paralysis, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. Brooks spent over 5 years on death row while his appeals worked through the court system. His attorneys challenged both his conviction and the constitutionality of lethal injection, arguing that the untested method constituted cruel and unusual punishment. However, federal courts rejected these arguments, paving the way for the execution to proceed. On that December evening in 1982, Brooks was strapped to a gurney in the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. As witnesses watched through glass windows, medical personnel inserted intravenous lines into his arms. The warden read the execution warrant, and at 12:09 a.m., the lethal drugs began flowing. Brooks was pronounced dead 7 minutes later, becoming the first of what would eventually be hundreds of executions by lethal injection across the United States. His death marked not just a resumption of capital punishment in Texas, but the beginning of a new era in American executions. Case 2. Carla Tucker. Executed date, February 3, 1998. Final words, "Yes, sir, I would like to say to all of you, the Thornton family and Jerry's family, that I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this. Baby, I love you. Ron, give Peggy a hug for me. Everybody, I'm going to be with Jesus now. I will see you all when you get there. I will wait for you." The last meal, a banana, a peach, and a salad with ranch dressing. The nation had never seen anything quite like it. a condemned woman on television, speaking with the soft conviction of someone who claimed to have found God on death row, asking for forgiveness while facing execution. Carla Tucker, number 145 in Texas's relentless march of capital punishment, became far more than just another statistic. She became the center of a fierce national debate about redemption, gender, and whether a soul truly transformed deserved to die for the sins of her past. The crimes that led Tucker to death row occurred on June 13, 1983, during what began as a burglary at a Houston apartment. Tucker, then 23 years old, had accompanied her boyfriend Daniel Garrett and another accomplice to the residence of Jerry Lindeen. What they intended as a simple theft quickly escalated into something far more sinister when they discovered Dean was home. The attack that followed was brutal beyond comprehension. Tucker and her companions turned on Dean with savage intensity, using a pickaxe as their weapon of choice. The violence didn't end with Dean's death. When Deborah Thornton, a woman who was with Dean, attempted to hide under bed sheets, Tucker continued the assault, striking her repeatedly with the same pickaxe until she too was dead. During the subsequent investigation, police uncovered evidence that painted a picture of premeditated violence rather than a burglary gone wrong. The crime scene told a story of prolonged brutality, with both victims suffering multiple wounds from the pickaxe. Perhaps most damaging to Tucker's case was a tape recording that surfaced during the trial, in which she described experiencing sexual pleasure while committing the murders. Tucker was arrested, tried, and convicted of capital murder. The jury, faced with overwhelming evidence of her guilt and the particularly heinous nature of the crimes, sentenced her to death. Her co-defendant Daniel Garrett also received the death penalty, but died of liver disease while on death row before his execution could be carried out. What set Tucker's case apart from other death row inmates was her dramatic religious conversion while awaiting execution. She claimed to have become a born-again Christian, dedicating herself to Bible study and ministry work within the prison system. Her transformation appeared genuine to many observers, including prison chaplains and guards who witnessed her daily life on death row. Tucker's articulate television interviews in the years leading up to her execution sparked unprecedented debate about capital punishment. Religious leaders, politicians, and activists argued over whether her apparent redemption should warrant commuting her sentence to life imprisonment. The case became a lightning rod for discussions about forgiveness, the possibility of human transformation, and the role of gender in capital punishment. On February 3, 1998, despite international appeals for clemency and widespread media attention, Tucker became the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. Her death marked not just the end of a life, but the conclusion of one of the most widely debated capital cases in American history. The questions her case raised about redemption and justice continue to resonate in discussions about the death penalty today. Case 3. Kenneth McDuff. Executed date, November 17, 1998. Final words. When asked if he had a final statement, he said, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." A last meal, 2 T-bone steaks, fried chicken, French fries, and a beer. In the entire history of American capital punishment, no story matches the twisted path of Kenneth McDuff, a man who accomplished the seemingly impossible feat of escaping death row only to earn his way back through murder. McDuff stands alone as the only person believed to have been paroled from death row and then returned there for committing another killing, making his case a cautionary tale about second chances and the ultimate failure of the justice system to protect society from its most dangerous predators. McDuff's first encounter with death row came in 1968, when he was sentenced to die for a triple murder that had shocked Texas. 3 teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, had been brutally killed in what became known as the Broomstick Murders. McDuff had tortured and murdered the victims in a crime so heinous that it seemed to guarantee he would never see freedom again. However, fate and legal precedent intervened in ways no one could have predicted. When the Supreme Court effectively halted executions in 1972 with its decision in Furman v. Georgia, McDuff's death sentence was automatically commuted to life imprisonment. This legal development, intended to address constitutional concerns about capital punishment, inadvertently gave McDuff something he never deserved: a chance at eventual freedom. The commutation meant that instead of facing execution, he would serve a life sentence with the possibility of parole. The Texas parole system of the 1980s was overwhelmed and under pressure to reduce prison overcrowding. In what remains one of the most controversial parole decisions in state history, McDuff was released in 1989 after serving just 21 years for the triple murder. Prison officials and parole board members later admitted they had failed to fully grasp the danger he posed to society. His release would prove to be a catastrophic mistake that cost innocent lives. McDuff wasted no time returning to violence once freed. Within a few years of his parole, he had embarked on what authorities believe was a killing spree across Central Texas. His victims included young women who were abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered. The investigation into these crimes eventually led police back to McDuff, who had become a suspect in multiple disappearances and murders throughout the region. The case that sealed McDuff's fate was the abduction and murder of Melissa and Northrop, a pregnant convenience store clerk from Waco. On March 1, 1992, Northrop was working alone at the Quick Pack store when McDuff entered and abducted her. Her body was found later, and the evidence clearly pointed to McDuff as her killer. The brutality of the crime and McDuff's history made him an immediate target for prosecutors seeking the death penalty. McDuff was arrested, tried, and convicted of capital murder in Northrop's death. The jury, aware of his previous crimes and the circumstances of his controversial parole, sentenced him to death. This time, there would be no legal intervention to save him. On November 17, 1998, McDuff became execution number 161 in Texas, finally paying the ultimate price for crimes that span decades. His execution closed the book on one of the most disturbing cases in Texas criminal history, a case that exposed fatal flaws in the parole system and demonstrated the deadly consequences when society's most dangerous predators are given second chances they haven't earned. Case 4. Gary Graham. Executed date, June 22, 2000. A final words, a lengthy and defiant rant proclaiming his innocence and alleging racism. He said, "They're killing me tonight. They're murdering me tonight. This is a lynching. I want the world to know I am a black man, a revolutionary, and I am innocent." The last meal, he refused a last meal. Outside the red brick walls of the Huntsville unit, America's racial tensions crystallized into a scene that resembled a war zone more than an execution protest. Robed Ku Klux Klansmen faced off against armed Black Panthers, while Texas state troopers in full riot gear formed barriers between the opposing groups, all gathered because of one man's claims of innocence. Gary Graham, execution number 222, had transformed his death sentence into a lightning rod for discussions about race, justice, and the death penalty, creating one of the most volatile execution scenes in Texas history. The crime that brought Graham to death row occurred outside a Houston supermarket, where Bobby Lambert, a visitor from Arizona, had stopped during what should have been a routine evening. Lambert was leaving the store when he encountered Graham, who was engaged in what prosecutors described as a robbery attempt. The confrontation between the two men quickly escalated from a demand for money into deadly violence. According to the prosecution's case, Graham shot and killed Lambert during the attempted robbery, leaving the Arizona man dead in the supermarket parking lot. The crime appeared to be random, with Lambert simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time when Graham decided to commit armed robbery. The shooting occurred in front of the store, making it a public crime that shocked the local community and drew immediate police attention. The investigation into Lambert's murder centered on eyewitness testimony and evidence collected from the crime scene. Police identified Graham as a suspect based on witness descriptions and other evidence linking him to the area at the time of the shooting. However, the case against Graham would later become controversial, with his defense team arguing that the evidence was insufficient and the identification procedures were flawed. Graham was arrested, charged with capital murder, and tried in a Houston courtroom. The prosecution presented their case based on the evidence they had gathered, including eyewitness testimony placing Graham at the scene of the crime. The defense challenged the reliability of the identifications and argued that the evidence was not strong enough to support a conviction, let alone a death sentence. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury convicted Graham of capital murder and sentenced him to death. His case then began a long journey through the appeals process, during which his attorneys raised various challenges to both the conviction and the sentence. These appeals would continue for years, with Graham's legal team arguing that he had been wrongfully convicted and that racial bias had influenced his trial. As Graham's execution date approached, his case became a cause célèbre for death penalty opponents and civil rights activists who believed he was innocent. His claims of racial injustice and wrongful conviction drew national attention and brought protesters from across the country to Huntsville. The case highlighted ongoing concerns about the death penalty's application, particularly regarding minority defendants and cases with questionable evidence. On June 22, 2000, despite the protests and international attention, Graham was executed at the Huntsville unit. The execution occurred amid unprecedented security measures necessitated by the opposing groups gathered outside the prison. Graham maintained his innocence until the end, and his case continues to be cited by death penalty opponents as an example of potential injustice within the capital punishment system. Case 5. Cameron Todd Willingham. Executed date, February 17, 2004. Of final words, he delivered an obscenity-filled statement directed at his ex-wife, who was a witness. He said, "The only statement I want to make is that I am an innocent man convicted of a crime I did not commit. I have been persecuted for 12 years for something I did not do. From God's dust I came, and to dust I will return, so the earth shall become my throne." The last meal, barbecue ribs, onion rings, and enchiladas. In the annals of American capital punishment, few cases have sparked as much posthumous debate as that of Cameron Todd Willingham. What began as a horrific house fire in Corsicana, Texas, on December 23, 1991, would eventually become one of the most scrutinized executions in modern history, with forensic scientists, legal experts, and journalists questioning whether Texas had executed an innocent man. The case that seemed ironclad at trial would later crumble under the weight of evolving fire science and investigative journalism. On that winter morning in 1991, Cameron Todd Willingham's world was consumed by flames. The 23-year-old was asleep in his home when a fire erupted, ultimately claiming the lives of his 3 young daughters, 2-year-old Amber and 1-year-old twins Carmen and Cameron. Willingham escaped the blaze but was unable to save his children, who died from smoke inhalation in their bedrooms. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident quickly transformed into a capital murder case. Fire investigators, using techniques that would later be deemed outdated and unreliable, determined the fire was intentionally set. They pointed to what they called pour patterns on the floor, claiming these indicated the use of accelerant. They cited the crazed glass effect on windows and puddling of aluminum as evidence of arson. Based on this forensic analysis, prosecutors argued that Willingham had deliberately started the fire to kill his daughters. The case against Willingham also relied heavily on character evidence. Prosecutors painted him as an abusive husband and father, presenting testimony about his troubled relationship with his wife Stacy and his alleged mistreatment of the children. Neighbors testified about hearing arguments and seeing signs of domestic tension. The prosecution argued that Willingham had grown tired of fatherhood and chose murder as his escape. Willingham maintained his innocence throughout his trial and the 12 years he spent on death row. His defense team struggled against what appeared to be overwhelming physical evidence and damaging character testimony. In October 1992, a jury convicted him of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. On February 17, 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. He was 36 years old. However, his case would not end with his death. Years later, leading fire scientists would examine the evidence and conclude that the fire was likely accidental, not arson. The techniques used to convict Willingham had been discredited by advances in fire science, raising profound questions about the reliability of forensic evidence in capital cases. Case 6. Angel Resendez. Executed date, June 27, 2006. Of final words, I want to ask if it is in your heart to forgive me. You don't have to. I know I allowed the devil to rule my life. I just ask you to forgive me, and ask the Lord to forgive me for allowing the devil to deceive me. I thank you, Lord. I thank you for having patience with me. I am ready to go. Last meal, he requested a variety of foods including fried chicken, steak, and Mexican food but refused it all. For nearly a decade, America's vast railroad network became the hunting ground for one of the most elusive serial killers in the nation's history. Angel Maturino Resendez transformed the romance of freight train travel into a nightmare, using the rails as both his highway and his cover. By the time authorities connected the dots between seemingly random murders across multiple states, the man known as the Railroad Killer had already claimed at least 15 lives, earning himself a place on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and becoming the subject of one of the largest manhunts in modern American history. Angel Resendez was born in Mexico and lived a transient lifestyle that perfectly suited his criminal activities. He would hop freight trains, traveling thousands of miles across the American landscape, targeting victims who lived near railroad tracks. His method was as simple as it was terrifying. He would slip off trains in small towns and communities, break into homes close to the railway, and attack whoever he found inside with whatever weapons were available. The breadth of Resendez's killing spree was staggering. His victims ranged from college students to elderly couples, from ministers to doctors. He showed no pattern in victim selection beyond proximity to railroad lines, making him nearly impossible to predict or catch. Authorities in Texas, Kentucky, Georgia, Illinois, and Florida all linked murders to the drifter who seemed to vanish like smoke after each attack. The case that would ultimately send Resendez to death row occurred in December 1998 in West University Place, Texas. Dr. Claudia Benton, a respected 39-year-old physician, was found brutally murdered in her home near railroad tracks. She had been attacked with a bronze statue and a knife, typical of Resendez's pattern of using items found at the crime scene. The attack was particularly vicious, even by the standards of his other crimes. Dr. Benton's murder galvanized law enforcement efforts. The FBI increased the reward for Resendez's capture and launched an intensive publicity campaign. His photograph appeared on television screens across the nation, and authorities appealed directly to his family members to convince him to surrender. The pressure mounted as more jurisdictions connected their unsolved murders to the railroad killer. In July 1999, after months of negotiation through intermediaries, Resendez finally turned himself in at the international bridge between El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. His surrender came after his sister convinced him that cooperation might spare his life. Resendez was tried in Houston for Dr. Benton's murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including DNA evidence and witness testimony placing him near the scene. In May 2000, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Despite multiple appeals, his conviction and sentence were upheld by higher courts. Case 7. Raymond Landry. Executed date, December 13, 1988. Final words, if this is your will, let's do it. I'm ready to go. I love you all. I'll be waiting for you all. Let's go do it. I'm ready. A last meal, a breakfast of coffee and an orange. The execution chamber at the Huntsville unit had never witnessed such a moment of technical failure. On December 13, 1988, as Raymond Landry lay strapped to the gurney awaiting the flow of lethal chemicals, the unthinkable happened. The needle containing the deadly cocktail suddenly popped out of his arm, sending prison officials scrambling to salvage what was supposed to be a routine execution. But what crime had brought Landry to this unprecedented moment on death row? The path to that chaotic evening began years earlier with a restaurant robbery that turned fatal. Cosmas Pritis, a Houston restaurant owner, was working late at his establishment when Raymond Landry entered with robbery on his mind. What should have been a simple theft escalated into violence when Pritis resisted or perhaps simply found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Landry pulled out a gun and shot Pritis during the robbery, killing the restaurant owner in cold blood. The crime shocked the Houston community, where Pritis had built his business and served customers for years. Police investigators quickly linked Landry to the scene, and he was arrested within days of the murder. The case against Landry was straightforward. Prosecutors argued that he had committed capital murder during the course of an aggravated robbery, making him eligible for the death penalty under Texas law. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury had little difficulty reaching a verdict of guilty. During the penalty phase, they sentenced him to death, determining that the crime warranted the ultimate punishment. Landry's appeals process moved through the courts over several years, but his conviction and sentence were upheld at every level. By 1988, his legal options had been exhausted, and the state of Texas prepared to carry out his execution by lethal injection, the method that had become standard practice since Charlie Brooks Jr.'s historic execution 6 years earlier. On that December evening, witnesses gathered in the death chamber to observe what they expected would be a routine execution. Landry was strapped to the gurney, and medical personnel inserted the intravenous lines that would deliver the 3-drug combination designed to end his life. The warden read the execution warrant, and the process began. But then something unprecedented occurred. As the lethal chemicals began flowing, the needle suddenly popped out of Landry's arm, interrupting the execution process. Prison technicians quickly moved to address the mechanical failure, working to reinsert the needle while Landry remained conscious on the gurney. The witnesses watched in stunned silence as what should have been a clinical procedure descended into an awkward scramble to salvage the execution. After the technical difficulties were resolved and the needle properly reinserted, the execution proceeded. Landry was pronounced dead, becoming the 29th person executed in Texas since the resumption of capital punishment. His execution was notable not just for the crime that brought him there, but for being the first documented needle blowout in the Texas death chamber, a mechanical failure that would unfortunately occur again in future executions, raising questions about the reliability of lethal injection procedures. Case 8. Ponchi Wilkerson. Executed date, March 14, 2000. A final words, he declined to make a final statement. Last meal. He requested a lavish meal of fried chicken, shrimp, sausage, and a variety of other items, but refused it when it arrived. In the sterile silence of the Huntsville death chamber, prison officials thought they had seen everything that condemned inmates could possibly do in their final moments. Then Ponchi Wilkerson opened his mouth and spit out a handcuff key, stunning witnesses and revealing an escape plan so audacious that it defied belief. Wilkerson, execution number 210, had somehow managed to conceal the metal key in his mouth throughout the entire execution process, raising questions about security protocols that prison officials are still reluctant to discuss. The crime that brought Wilkerson to this moment occurred during an armed robbery at a Houston jewelry store. Chung Myong-e, a store employee, was working when Wilkerson entered with the clear intention of stealing merchandise and money. What began as a robbery quickly escalated when he either resisted or was perceived as a threat by Wilkerson, who was armed and prepared to use violence to accomplish his criminal goals. The confrontation inside the jewelry store ended tragically when Wilkerson shot and killed E. The employee, who was simply trying to earn a living and support his family, became another victim of armed robbery gone wrong. The shooting appeared to be calculated rather than impulsive, suggesting that Wilkerson had entered the store prepared to use lethal force if necessary to complete the theft. The investigation into Yee's murder moved forward systematically as Houston police gathered evidence from the crime scene and interviewed witnesses who might have seen Wilkerson in the area. Forensic evidence linked him directly to the shooting, and investigators were able to build a strong case connecting him to both the robbery and the murder. The evidence painted a clear picture of premeditated violence during the commission of a felony. Wilkerson was arrested and charged with capital murder in connection with Yee's death. The case proceeded through the court system, with prosecutors arguing that the murder occurred during the course of an armed robbery, making it eligible for the death penalty under Texas law. The defense struggled to present mitigating factors that might convince the jury to spare Wilkerson's life, but the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming. The trial resulted in Wilkerson's conviction for capital murder, and the jury sentenced him to death. His case moved through the standard appeals process over several years, with his attorneys challenging both the conviction and the sentence through various legal arguments. However, none of these appeals proved successful in overturning either the guilty verdict or the death sentence. As his execution date approached, Wilkerson apparently began planning what may have been intended as a final escape attempt. Exactly how he obtained the handcuff key and managed to conceal it in his mouth through multiple security checks remains a mystery that prison officials have never fully explained. On March 14, 2000, Wilkerson was strapped to the gurney in the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. after declining to make any final statement. He shocked everyone present by spitting out the handcuff key, creating a moment of chaos and confusion in what is normally a highly controlled environment. Despite this final act of defiance, the execution proceeded as scheduled, and Wilkerson was pronounced dead, taking the secrets of his escape plan with him. Case 9. Yakaman Hearn. Executed date, July 18, 2012. Final words, I'd like to tell my family that I love y'all and I wish y'all well. To my son, I love you and I'll always be with you. I am sorry for the pain and suffering I have caused. I am sorry. To my mother, I love you. You are the best. I love all y'all. I am ready. Last meal, a cheeseburger with bacon, French fries, and a soft drink. When pharmaceutical companies began refusing to supply drugs for executions in the early 2010s, death penalty states faced an unprecedented crisis that would fundamentally reshape how America carries out capital punishment. The pressure from anti-death penalty activists had convinced European manufacturers to cut off the supply of drugs like sodium thiopental and pancuronium bromide, forcing states to scramble for alternatives or risk halting executions entirely. On July 15, 2012, Texas made history when Yakaman Hearn became the first person executed using a single dose of pentobarbital, marking a pivotal moment that would influence execution protocols across the nation and demonstrate how external pressures could force changes to America's most solemn legal procedure. The case that brought Yakaman Hearn to death row began on May 27, 1998, in Dallas County. Frank Mazier, a 53-year-old man, became the victim of a violent carjacking that would cost him his life. Hearn, then 20 years old, approached Mazier and demanded his vehicle. What started as a robbery quickly escalated into something far more sinister. During the carjacking, Hearn forced Mazier into the victim's own car and drove him to a remote location. The encounter turned deadly when Hearn shot Mazier, killing him during what prosecutors described as a robbery gone wrong. The crime demonstrated the kind of senseless violence that often characterizes capital cases, where a relatively simple theft transforms into murder. The investigation moved swiftly as police gathered evidence linking Hearn to both the carjacking and the murder. Witnesses had seen the initial confrontation, and physical evidence connected Hearn to the crime scene. The case proceeded through the Dallas County court system, where prosecutors successfully argued that the murder occurred during the commission of a felony, making it eligible for capital punishment under Texas law. The jury convicted Hearn of capital murder, and after considering the evidence and circumstances, they sentenced him to death. His case then entered the lengthy appeals process that characterizes death penalty cases, working its way through state and federal courts over more than a decade. By the time Hearn's execution date arrived in 2012, Texas faced a drug shortage crisis that was affecting execution states nationwide. The traditional three-drug cocktail that had been used for lethal injections was no longer available due to manufacturing restrictions. Prison officials had to develop a new protocol using pentobarbital, a barbiturate that had been used in some states but, on July 15, 2012, Yakaman Hearn was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. He was 34 years old. His execution marked not just the end of his life, but the beginning of a new era in how Texas would carry out capital punishment, as the state adapted to the changing landscape of execution protocols in America. These 9 Texas executions reveal capital punishment's most haunting paradox. In society's ultimate act of justice, we often discover our most profound failures of understanding. Each case we've examined tonight demonstrates that the final moments of a condemned life can illuminate truths that years of investigation, trials, and appeals never uncovered. From last words that exposed corruption to final meals that honored forgotten victims, these executions became more than legal proceedings. They became mirrors reflecting our collective conscience. The death chamber doesn't just end lives, it crystallizes the complexity of human nature itself. Whether through redemption, defiance, or devastating honesty, these 9 individuals forced America to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mercy, and what it truly means to be human when everything else has been stripped away. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Crime Inquiry as we continue exploring the cases that changed America forever.